Hey loves, Tony here from TL Yarn Crafts, and today we're talking all about temperature blankets. So I'm going to take you on a little walk down memory lane with me. Back in January of 2019, I embarked on this journey to make the perfect temperature blanket. I put in a lot of time, a lot of math, and a lot of yarn to make this happen, and here she is in the flesh in all of her glory. I'm so happy with how this blanket turned out, but I will say not everything about it was perfect. So in this video, I want to take you down that journey with me, let you know what worked well, what didn't, and what I'm planning to change for 2020. So first off, if you don't know what I'm talking about, here's what a temperature blanket is. It's essentially a year-long project where you commit to crocheting or knitting a certain number of rows or a certain number of motifs based on a temperature gauge that you create at the beginning of the year. Based on that gauge, you're going to use a certain color, and by the end of the year, you're going to have this nice kind of random assortment of colors throughout this big blanket that you can use to kind of reminisce about the year and look back on all of your hard work. I did a series of YouTube videos and blog posts at the beginning of 2019 that should answer a lot of your questions if you're still not familiar with temperature blankets. I've included links to all of that content down in the description. So my temperature blanket started off with this gorgeous palette of colors that I got from Knit Picks. I used 9 different colors from their Swish DK line. That's a DK weight yarn, so a little bit lighter than worsted weight. Next up, I needed to create my temperature gauge. So I live in the Midwest in Ohio here in the States, and that means that our temperatures range a whole lot throughout the year. So I had the low end of my temperature gauge at 18 degrees and the high end at 81. From there, I broke my temperature gauge up into groups that had about 9 degrees in each, and then I assigned a color to each of those groups. Once the temperature gauge was done, I then had to decide on the actual pattern. So at the top of 2019, I was totally obsessed with Tunisian crochet, still am, that's probably not going to change, but I wanted to infuse Tunisian crochet into my actual temperature blanket. So I decided to do a set of panels, and I did that for a few different reasons. One is because I knew that 365 rows of Tunisian crochet was going to be massive, so I wanted to do 5 separate panels to make this a little bit more of a throw size. And then I decided to do 3 rows per day to still make this come out a decent size when I put it in the panels. So I did 3 rows per day, did join as you go panels, and 5 total panels. I have a full free pattern based on my 2019 temperature blanket on my blog if you want those full details. A couple other details about the way that I did my blanket is that I did use the average temperatures each day for my rows. I know some people like to use the highs, some people like to use the lows. I decided to use the averages, and I kind of did chunks of my blanket every single Sunday. So I would keep track of the average temperatures throughout the week, and then on Sunday I just sat aside a little block of time and worked on my temperature blanket until I was all caught up again. This seemed like a great way to kind of spend a nice amount of time with my temperature blanket and also just manage my time well. Of course, I'm a full-time crochet designer, so that takes up a ton of time. Wanted to make sure I could still spend time with my friends and family, but I saw my temperature blanket as kind of like that personal project that I could escape to, so I wanted to have a nice chunk of time that I could spend with it each week. So the beginning of the year was amazing for my temperature blanket progress. I was super hyped up about it. I had this gorgeous color palette that I couldn't wait to break into. I had this all over my Instagram. My Facebook community was like, go girl, you got this. Everybody was really, really excited about this. And then the summer hit. So as a crochet designer, the summer is really, really a tricky time for me because that's kind of when I'm thinking ahead to fall and winter. So I was working on my fall and winter designs in the summer, and my temperature blanket just kind of fell to the wayside. I ended up being months and months behind, and part of me truly thought about just scrapping the whole thing. When I got to that point when I was thinking about scrapping the blanket, I decided to kind of talk it through with my network of people that I bounce ideas off of, and they basically said, like, you're really invested in this. Your temperature blanket is beautiful. You really love it too. So just take a little break from it and go back to it. So that's exactly what I did. From June till about September, I didn't even touch my temperature blanket. I was like, I'm not even going to get stressed out about this. I'm not going to worry about it. It'll be there when I'm ready for it. September hit. I took a little bit of a break from my other projects and just cranked it out on my temperature blanket and got caught up. And then in October, I took another little break from my temperature blanket to kind of focus on actually releasing all those patterns that I had worked on over the summer. And then when December hit, I got completely caught up again. I had maybe like 2.5 months of progress to get caught up on. And then I did it, and it was really, really fun. Like, as I was taking those breaks and getting back to my blanket, it was kind of a reminder of why I even started this in the first place. It was my chance to step away from kind of the hustle and the bustle and the rat race of my business to really do something that I enjoy. I often have to remind myself that I got into crocheting in the first place truly as a hobby, as a way to pass the time and to feel productive. And I feel like with my temperature blanket, when I got behind and was able to get caught up again, I kind of revisited that mindset of saying, like, I really do enjoy crocheting. I love doing this as a hobby, and I love to be able to make something just for myself. And that is what my temperature blanket was to me throughout the year. So here's my temperature blanket in all her glory, all 4,000 square inches of her. I'm so excited and so proud of this project. This is really the first time that I've ever committed to a project for that long, and that's part of the reason why I did it, to just kind of prove to myself that I can work on a project that long, complete it, and just find all the joy in not only the planning, the process, and then the finish of it. It was truly a joy to work on. And like I said, I've got the full details of how you can make your own Tunisian crochet temperature blanket on my blog. So as proud as I am of myself and of this project, there are a lot of mistakes that I made along this journey to my temperature blanket. And the very first one came right in the beginning, and it had to do with my temperature gauge. So I used 9 colors and broke up my temperature gauge into 9-degree increments. But what I didn't consider is that here in the Midwest, we hover around the same like 5 to 10 degrees in the middle of summer and in the middle of winter. And what that meant is that when I was tracking my average temperatures, it would have kept me in the same color for like 30, sometimes 40 rows. That definitely was not what I was going for. I really wanted kind of this randomness color blocking. I didn't want big, giant blocks of color. To remedy this in my 2020 blanket, I've created a temperature gauge that has groups that are only about 6 or 7 degrees each. My second mistake had to do with my math. Now, I did a ton of math leading up to this project, but somehow I still ended up 2 days short on my last column. I truly have no idea how that happened. Another math mistake that I made was when I was working in my rows, sometimes I would count and find that I was 1, 2, sometimes even 3 stitches short on that row. So I would compensate for it by adding a stitch here and there in subsequent rows. And you really can't tell from a distance, like I can't even see where the mistakes are now, but I know that they're there and they just kind of eat at me. To make sure I don't have those issues moving forward, I spent a ton more time working out the actual math, the measurements, the stitch counts, all that good stuff for my 2020 blanket. So fingers crossed it's a little more perfect this time around. And then the third mistake that I made, of course, was letting myself fall really behind, not once but twice in 2019 as I was working on my temperature blanket. At the beginning of 2019, when I was making my videos and blog posts, I preached about time management and making sure that you set aside time every single week to work on your temperature blanket. I fell into my own trap. I had no idea this was going to happen, but I'm truly not surprised. Another thing that I said in my early videos was that life is going to happen. It's going to get in the way and you might fall behind. So I had to watch those videos over again to encourage myself throughout the year to finish up my temperature blanket. So for my 2020 project, I completely redesigned my temperature blanket. It uses a lot less stitches per day of work. And I'm also going to go back to my once a week batching system. That truly is what works best for me, and it helps me get all the work done at once. I wasn't the only person working on a temperature blanket in 2019. There were a ton of you all over Instagram and in my Facebook group who not only shared your projects with us, but also some great advice. So I want to share a bit of that here too. So Donna from our Facebook group suggested making sure you get plenty of yarn in each of your colors right up front, and I couldn't agree more. I would suggest that once you pick out your color palette, get 2 to 3 full-size balls of your yarn to make sure that you can get a good chunk of your project done before you have to re-up on yarn later in the year. Emily, who's also in our Facebook group, recommended picking a color palette that you absolutely love. This is amazing advice because you have to consider how long you're going to be spending with this project, an entire year. So if you decide in March that you really don't like the colors, you're probably not going to finish. I know the default color palette for a temperature blanket is a rainbow, and you can absolutely do that if that's the palette that you love. But you can really think outside the box and personalize this with whatever colors that you want. I personally love pink, a lot, and that's why there's so much of it in my blanket, but I also added in some warm neutrals. Now you can do neons, you can do pastels, you can do ombres. I even saw somebody who did a gradient of just grays, blacks, and whites, and it was a beautiful blanket. So really play around with color palettes early on in the year to make sure you have a project that you'll love working on until Christmas. Emily from the Facebook group also gave the advice not to get down on yourself when you get behind in your project. I fell victim to this as well, and I can say that you kind of get this defeatist attitude when you've got weeks and weeks and weeks of your project that you need to get caught up on. My first suggestion is to just recognize that you're getting behind on your project, understand that it's sitting there and that it will be there when you get back to it, and then just plan a time to make it happen. When I decided to take my break from June to September, I knew that by mid-September I would have a little bit of downtime to work on my temperature blanket. That made it so I was comfortable kind of putting it to the side and knowing that I would get to it at another time. If you fall behind on your project, I would encourage you to drop into my Facebook group, TLYC Makers, or even just post some photos in your stories and get that encouragement from the other makers in the community so you can get back to your project when you're ready. And a last piece of advice that came from my friend Marcia on Instagram was to add some kind of placeholder within your project. So in my project, you can see that I've got these white stripes here, and those delineate the beginning of a month. Now, when I put my project down from June to September, having those white stripes made it so I could easily pick up right where I left off and count to see what day I stopped on. If you don't have any kind of markers in your project, you're gonna have to count from the very, very beginning to see where you stopped, unless you've been keeping meticulous notes, and like, who even does that? I don't know. So you can build something into the actual pattern to make note of maybe the beginning of the month or the beginning of a week, something like that. Or you can just use stitch markers. You can attach a stitch marker at the beginning of a certain month, so then you can count up from there and just keep stitch markers at the beginning of each month as you work on your project, and take them out at the end when you're ready to do your finishing. So I used 2019 to figure out if I even like making temperature blankets, and thankfully I really, really do. So I've got one planned for 2020, and I can't wait to get started. I am impatiently waiting on my yarn right now, and I'll share that with you soon. If you're planning to make a temperature blanket, I would love if you share your journey with us. Use the hashtag crochetTempBlanket2020 on Instagram and share your project with us in the TLYC Makers Facebook group. Thanks so much for watching this video. Please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing, and I can't wait to crochet along with you. Bye!